Yeah, so depressing how few mosaic people are left. It's kind of like when you get old, all your friends start to die off, right? It's like the news gets more and more depressing. Prince, David Bowie, mosaic users. Yeah. So anyway, since it's a little bit before lunch, you may be starting to get a bit tired. I have a way of awakening you, I hope. Let's see if it works. Okay, wait, should we make that louder? Okay, let's try that a little bit louder because there's a part after that that's even better. All right, was it cranked? All right, Denver. Here it comes. And thank you very much. So, a couple years ago, we had a lawsuit in the tech industry. It was actually the biggest patent lawsuit in the technology industry to date. There was $2 billion under contention. And it made all the press that you'd expect. People are talking about it around the world because what happened was it was Apple suing Samsung over the design of the iPhone, right? And you all are probably familiar with the iPhone. It's the one on the right or left. I think it's the one on the left. And what happened was Apple said, hey, Samsung, you're infringing on our patents. I think they had like 3 utility patents, 4 design patents or something like that for this device. But there was one patent in particular that formed the basis of this lawsuit for why Apple took a $2 billion effort against Samsung. And it was something that literally had a picture that just looked like this. It was just this little rectangle. And it was, as design patents are, they're basically just pictures. There's very few words. And Apple's design patent had very, very few words. And I have to read from my screen so I get the lawyer speak correct. It said, this patent covers this smartphone and its ornamental design substantially as shown and described. That's all it said. And what you saw was just kind of this black rectangle. And it was this design that Samsung called in a whole bunch of expert witnesses. They sort of paraded a whole bunch of them through. And what they argued was, you can't protect this. This is not only something that we're not going to pay any money for, but this patent shouldn't be valid. And why did they say that? They said, because it's so obvious. It's such an obvious design. It's just a rectangle. Right? Anybody could have gotten there eventually. Right? How can you protect something that is so inevitable, so obvious, such a kind of design that anyone can get to? But if we go back now about 10 years and we look at the introduction of this obvious product, were things really as obvious back then as they claimed about what this would become? Because when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, for those of you that remember, he basically said it was 3 different things. So of the 3 things that came to create this device, one was the iPod, the other one was the phone, and the third one was the internet communicator. We all laugh. Every time I say that now, people laugh. Right? Like, but that's literally what they called it, the internet communicator. And it was the combination of these 3 things together that was supposed to create this next generation device that was going to leapfrog the devices that were out there. Because if you remember, there actually were smartphones at the time of this. They just looked like Blackberries, or the Motorola Q thing, those sorts of devices. So there was like 60 million of those sold a year at the time. But the modern mobile smartphone started off as a combination of these 3 things. So let's look at it. iPod was this original concept that Apple had a lot of success with of storing 1,000 songs in your pocket. Right? You put all these songs on this little iPod, you carry them around with you, and you basically download your music and listen to it anywhere. And it had a pretty good run. So if we look at what the growth rates of song download on iTunes look like, back in 2006 when this device came out, they were growing at something like 60%, and they grew at 40%, and now we have hit negative growth. So the 1,000 songs in your pocket really didn't pan out to be as transformational as maybe people at the time thought, right? Very compelling at the time, but has quite clearly petered off since then. So what about the phone part? Maybe the phone was the special sauce that merited this $2 billion lawsuit. And again, if you look at the phone over the years, clearly a lot of these devices have made their way into our pockets. But if you look at the amount of voice data that's happening, it's pretty much just stayed flat. Despite more and more of these devices entering the market all the time, the amount that we spend talking on them via phones is not really changing. In fact, it's interesting if you go and ask people, how many times do you actually make a voice call on your smartphone per week? Right? This is actually per week. And about 5 years ago or so, almost everybody was taking a voice call at least once per week. Now, 30% of people don't even take a call once a week. I'm one of those people, by the way. If my phone rings, what is this? What? Kind of freaks me out. So not only does data show it from a quantitative perspective, but also when you talk to people, you find that the same thing is true. So the phone didn't really seem to be the thing that merited this $2 billion lawsuit. So what happens if we then look at the internet communicator? And the funny thing about the internet communicator, it was the thing that got the least amount of time during that original keynote. Right? There was a really brief section where they talked about this thing. But if you go back to my voice versus data chart, and now instead of only showing voice information, I show the actual data. Here we go. You can see that actually turned out to be a very, very big thing, right? So the big win out of this was the internet communicator piece. And having this personal computer in our pockets connected to the internet has given birth to hundreds of millions, if not billions, of ideas, not the least of which is streaming music. So it's not that Apple was necessarily wrong that we like to have music in our pockets. It's just that iPod structure of downloading songs actually has over time given way to more of an internet communicator-based means of listening to music through streaming. And if you compare kind of where people are making money, you can see music streaming has surpassed music downloads. And in fact, music streaming is now actually some substantial portion of overall music revenue. I think within the year, it's going to cross the 50% mark and become the dominant way by which people make money off of music. So it's not that the songs were wrong. It's just that they were all about the internet communicator. And so when I look at this, right, and I kind of come back to that original introduction, I see these three things, and I say to myself, you know what? 1 out of 3 ain't too bad. But it's also an interesting story in terms of evolution and iteration. Right? We tend to put a lot of credit in the original introduction of things and getting it all right at the same time. And even the most popular product in terms of scale, right, the smartphone, really took a while to find its course. It wasn't immediately clear what that thing was good for. Right? A similar story is going on with smartwatches and a lot of other technology that we have in our lives. There's a period where you kind of have to keep with it and figure out what it's good for. So anyway, not a lot necessarily obvious at launch, right? A lot had to be learned. But to come back to this Apple versus Samsung thing, we heard Samsung's side of the argument. Design is inevitable. Anybody would have come up with it over time. It's, super obvious. What did Apple argue? What was their side of the coin? They said, obvious? Inevitable? Are you freaking kidding me? Do you have any idea how many prototypes we made over the 5 years that we locked people in the basement to create this thing? They didn't see their families. They couldn't go home on weekends because we're churning through so many prototypes and form factors to get to what you now call obvious. There's a huge amount of variances, refinement, and painstaking work to get to this thing that you now see in front of you. In fact, let's zoom in, look at a whole bunch of these things together. They said no design detail was immune from this process. Even very simple things, stuff that seemed like it would be pretty clear, like the hardware button. They had 50 different refinements of that hardware button. So span that out over 5 years, right? That's like almost every month there's another hardware button review. Here we go again. Let's look at it one more time. And it's like 10 hardware button refinements per year. It's pretty brutal. So their core thesis was what seems obvious now clearly was not. Took many years of iteration, lots and lots of prototypes, lots and lots of hardware reviews. But in the end, yeah, we did get to something that feels inevitable. And kind of the statement that comes to mind is design is only obvious in retrospect. Right? It's after you've gone through all of that hard work and you've tried all these things that don't work, and eventually you've gotten to the thing that does work. That's where it feels clear, right? That's where it feels focused. That's where it feels, if I can use the word, right. So that sounds good. We all want to create these obvious designs, right? But if it's only obvious in retrospect that something is good or inevitable, how do you figure it out along the way? How do you create these kinds of obvious designs? Well, sticking with Apple for half a second, we can go back to looking at the release of Maps on iOS. When iOS 10 came out, they did a big redesign of iOS Maps. And one of the things that happened with the original Maps release, at least for Apple, they got a lot of slack for this. Do you remember why? Like, it would kind of drive you into a lake when you're trying to go home. It would label ancient cathedrals as Burger Kings. Does anybody remember this? Right? Mapgate or whatever. They just throw gate at the end of everything now. So this was a really maligned release for them. Caused them a ton of headaches, created real problems, and actually, in some cases, endangered people. But one operating system ago, they redesigned Maps completely, and they went from that old version that had stuck around for a couple years to a totally redesigned version. And now, if you look at the conversations people have about Apple Maps, it's completely flipped. In fact, these things are universally praised. So just as a small example here, so much better, truly confusing before. The new Apple Maps are a breath of fresh air in the Apple ecosystem. I believe that's a nerd compliment, so I think it's good. Now, if you care about obviousness and simplicity in design, you probably get curious when something that had a lot of problems before was characterized as confusing, hard to use, just overall bad, to now people love it and think it's great. Well, what did they change? How did they make that transition from difficult and confusing to fresh breath of air, right? And so we can look at some of the changes that happened, and we can take what people in the industry call a heuristic evaluation. Right? Heuristic evaluation is basically, I know something about design, I'll look at it and tell you what I think, based on my experience, things I've seen, what have you. And so looking at it that way, right, we can kind of identify some of these reasons. And it also helps in a heuristic evaluation if you have some core use cases, or you kind of can evaluate against what people are trying to do. That's really useful. So one key use case for Maps is going somewhere, right? Getting directions. So the way you would do that before in Maps, you would have to tap search to start. So, that's a little weird, right? In the new version, however, there is a field that says, where do you want to go? What do you think is more obvious? Probably the thing that says, where do you want to go? Perhaps. Another example, in the previous version of Maps, the way you actually start directions is you hit that blue text on screen there, the one that's a tiny bit more bluish and bolder. See that one? Route, not to be confused with all the other blue text on there. In the redesigned version, you have this giant thing that looks like a touchable element. We in the industry call it a button. You may have forgotten what those look like, but that's what they are. And you can see it says directions, 30-minute drive. There's a big kind of a strong visual contrast, to use the language of design, right? Visual contrast, affordance. Affordance looks like something you can tap. Strong visual contrast to make something pop up. So you want a primary action that's really bold and noticeable. And clearly, big difference between this before and after view, right? So we can say maybe these primary actions, maybe these clear call to actions, all these things are adding up. And in fact, net, there was a ton of design changes. Many of them likely contributed to these positive feelings. So if we look before, there was a separation between where you're going and how you're going to get there. And in the new version, there's this really clear to Charleston Road from my location, 30 minutes, fastest route go, and you've got the drive, walk, transit options right there as opposed to separated. And you know, if you show these to two people and you ask like, which one's more obvious? Guess which one they're gonna pick. Like, duh. Well, if it's so duh, why did that design A get made, B live on for, you know, at least 3 or 4 years? So it's not necessarily so obvious at the time how this looks. But again, strong visual contrast, all these things. So many things kind of came together, but do we really know which ones were the important ones? Was it the contrast? Was it the button shape? Was it the copy that we inserted in there? What helped make a good design? How do we know? We want to make great designs. How can we decipher this? Here's another example. We see apps and big companies making changes. And a lot of times what we end up doing is like looking at what other people are doing, which is really, really dangerous because we don't know why they did it, right? We just sort of assume LinkedIn knows what they're doing. They probably have like 50 designers over there. You know? I bet they A/B tested the hell out of that. Maybe. Or maybe they're like getting their free swag hoodie at a wine retreat, you know? Things like that also happen at big companies. But people watch big companies and see what they're doing. And so LinkedIn went from this primary navigation in their app of a logo and overflow menu, which you probably don't know that's what the menu is, but there's 3 little dots there. And they shifted over to a bottom navigation menu. Was this a good change? How do we know? Should we do that? LinkedIn did it, we should probably do it. What about when you see another big company like eBay do the opposite? They went from a bottom navigation menu to a hamburger menu. And now your mind's like, oh, don't know who to copy. Which one? Who more likely to have more designers and A/B tests? Don't know. Hard to say. So we don't have a lot of proof. What about if you see before the eBay app used to have a bunch of 5-star reviews, and after they made that switch, they have a bunch of 1-star reviews? Does that help you kind of like, maybe not so good? Gives you a little something to go off of, right? If their app ratings plummet when they make a particular kind of design change, that may be some evidence. What about when 6 months later they go from the hamburger menu right back to that bottom navigation menu? Then what do you think? Well, maybe those guys at LinkedIn really know what they're doing. Sometimes we're blessed by companies that actually take the time to share, and they write up stuff. They share their data. They share their thinking. Right? Like, here's why we made this design change, and here's what happened. So Spotify did this. They ran the same gamut. They went from the hamburger menu down to a bottom navigation menu in a redesign recently. And you know, a lot of their users kind of praised this on the Twitter sphere as well. But they released an article and they talked about what they did. They released some stats too. And they said, when we made this change, we saw a 30% increase in menu item use and a 9% increase in actions overall. Drop mic, right? Is that good? Do you want your actions to go up 9%? Maybe, I don't know. For Google.com, the measure is get people off the page as fast as possible. So increasing actions by 9% would be a complete failure for that particular product. And again, it's sort of evidence, like just because somebody else does it doesn't mean we necessarily should do it. Although I bet they had some sort of, big party for whoever ran this project, because they had some kind of measure that actions need to go up, and they did it. So Are these good things? Should we be doing these things? And I bring all this up because, just to be very, very honest with you, most of the design work I see people doing is they're looking at what other people are doing, right? And it's generous to say getting inspiration from, right? It's perhaps a little bit more accurate to say borrowing from. But in most cases, they don't know why. And as I'll explain, it's dangerous for a couple reasons. Like A, it could actually harm you, but B, it makes it a hell of a lot more difficult to bring all the people along that you need to bring along when you do things like major changes to the digital presence of a company. Right? If your only argument is Facebook's doing it, you're standing on a pretty rickety ladder if anybody chooses to challenge that or ask, well, why? Right? So my goal is to help you a little bit, and I want to kind of go behind the scenes. And we did something as part of one of my teams at Google that probably doesn't seem so controversial, but hopefully as I walk you through it, you'll understand that it actually turned out to be a big deal. So what we did is we took an Android app, in case this was Google's social network, G+, and we added this bottom navigation menu that I showed you earlier to this app. And so a couple things. One, why talk so much about a navigation change? A navigation change is actually a really, really big deal for how a service is interpreted, right? What you see on screen tells you what you can do there, what you should do there, how the thing operates, what value it gives you. And not only does it do that, it then also allows you to do the thing that that thing is for. So the things you show on the screen about what this does and how you can use it to achieve those things is basically the entire essence of your product. So navigation changes, navigation redesigns are a really, really big deal and can have a ton of impact, right? And so they're worth spending a good amount of time on, as you'll see a little bit later. And the other reason why I want to talk about this is because I can go pretty deep. I can show you all the little things that we did that got to something that at the end, maybe you're like, well, that's kind of obvious. But how did we get there and why, right? So let's talk about some of the rationale behind this. And effectively, there was three really big reasons why we started going on this purpose, down this path. One is really wanted to focus on what is this thing good for? It may surprise some of you, but it's not clear to a lot of people what Google Plus is for. I know that's a shocker, right? But it was true. So we really wanted to communicate, what is this thing for? What's its purpose? How can you use it? And then we wanted to make sure people actually can use it and can use it easily. That's kind of the next two bullets. But the first high-level thing was to communicate the core purpose and get people in here. And what were we starting from? This is kind of what the Android app looked like at the beginning. And believe it or not, there actually is a whole bunch of navigation here. If anybody can guess where it is that white bar at the top with the word home. And do you see that teeny little triangle there, that little tiny little guy? If you knew that that was something that could guide you to using this app and service, and you then tapped on it, you could actually navigate around, right? But up front, not necessarily clear that that's what you should be doing. Now, when and if you got the sense to hit that menu, it would actually reveal all the features within the app. And when I say all the features, I mean all the features that were within the app. 5 years worth of features, as a matter of fact. Does anybody use Google Photos? Okay. How many of you knew all of Google Photos was in Google Plus before we released Google Photos? Okay, 3 of you, cool. It was. Google Maps has this awesome location sharing feature right now. Used to be inside of Google Plus, right? So there's a lot of stuff in here, and it was very difficult for people to know what they should be doing. Because not only was all this hidden, but everything was sort of treated equally, visually. Right? Whether it was communities or locations or events or photos, all this stuff was sort of listed out in the exact same way without any clear guidance around what you should or could do here. So, of course, what we try to do to understand how to make sense of this is we go and get closer to the customer, as Jeffrey said. And what was really neat is we were able to assemble a group of people who were very passionate and very happy using the product. People who are spending hours in there a day, constantly engaging. We call them the people who got to a happy state group. And we went to these people and we said, hey, people in a happy state, would you mind helping us get other people to a happy state? And so we created a community from them. We talked to them every now and then. And one of the things we asked the people who were in this happy state was, well, what do you use the most? Out of all this big, long list of features, what are you doing day in, day out, right? And so the first thing we found was there was two things in particular that they would use multiple times. And one of them was this thing called communities, which is like a group of people talking about a topic. Another thing is this thing called a collection, which is sort of like a series of posts around a topic, right? A series of posts around mountain biking, if you will, or artificial intelligence, what have you. So people use these two things a whole bunch of times. And of course, you can't just listen to what people tell you because they may not know necessarily the biases they hold, or they may not necessarily think it through, or frankly, they may just lie to you, which actually happens a ton. There was a good friend of mine, Bob Moesta, who's one of the co-founders of this thing called Jobs to be Done. He always tells the story how he stumbled onto that methodology because he just got frustrated with people lying to him. He would be doing market research for a car company, right? And he'd go and talk to this couple. And they're like, we're going to buy a car. It's like, oh, okay, well, what kind of car? They're like, anything but a minivan. It's never going to be a minivan. Well, maybe an SUV, or maybe we want this BMW thing over here. 3 months later, he goes back to him and they bought a minivan. All right, and he's like, what the heck is happening? So he got super frustrated and he made this whole methodology. But the bottom line is you can't just listen to what people tell you. It's not the full story. So we also look at quantitative data. And when we did, we saw there was actually a nice match. There was 1.2 million people joining communities a day. So not only are people telling us these things are good, I use them, but we actually see people using them. And this combination of the two data points, this quantitative versus qualitative data point, I think is critical. So does anybody know what this chart shows? I'll give you a hint. That's kilometers per hour on the vertical axis there. This is a crash in the third stage of the Tour de France based on the onboard computers of the bikers. And what you can basically see is they're biking and everything goes to hell. But if you look at the qualitative side, right, you get a very different story. There's a guy walking down the road with like blood coming off his leg. There's a guy in the back there literally crying because he's been training for 5 years for this moment and somebody locked pedals with him and he fell and it's all over. You get a very different set of information when you look at the qualitative side than when you get just the quantitative side. And so it's very, very important to bring those two things together. You can't just look at one or the other. So those two things together help you out a lot. And when you come back to this, right, we had a nice affinity. The other thing we did, and this is also kind of a, I guess, realization I've come to over the years, is the average user is anything but. Averages are very, very dangerous. So what we end up doing is we actually look at the extremes. We look at the people who are super active, super happy, love it, and then we talk to people who have no idea what the hell is going on, right? Totally on the opposite side of the coin. New people who come in and really can't figure things out. And we spend a bunch of time seeing where they were overwhelmed, what they were overwhelmed by, and what happened. And after getting kind of these different input points and these different types of groups, we ended up with a couple high-level goals. One, we want to simplify things for newcomers. And two, we want to take the things that make people happy, that make them satisfied, that they like, and bring them front and center. Just make it much more clear that that's where the good stuff is. So to do that, we did something that's a little bit more like a traditional design process, right? We went and built a bunch of different prototypes. We made a prototype a week, roughly. Every time we made a prototype, we went and learned in the lab. We would then tweak things, change things, and at the end of that week, we'd start again. And after about 7 rounds of this type of behavioral research, what we ended up with is something that was meeting those goals we had. Right? We thought we had a design that accomplished this. So we found new users would kind of just jump in here and start exploring right away. They would use the menu, they'd move between the tabs, and they would get oriented really quickly and easily. And our superpower users who love these features, these collections of community things, were immediately able to jump into those areas because they were front and center. So this was good. And we thought, okay, looks like something is coming together here. But in addition to simplifying and making these key actions front and center, we also had this high-level goal that many of you probably have, which is around engagement. And sometimes that gets thrown around as a dirty word, right? People do the wrong things for engagement, like throw banner ads at you or all the terrible things we saw before. But ultimately, I think we're building software that people should use, or we would like people to use them. And so a very good metric of are you making useful software is anybody using it, right? And that's why I think this metric comes up all the time around engagement. It's not like this notoriously bad thing. It's I make something. If you use it, I feel good. So I would like to know if you're using it or not. And the more you use it, the gooder I feel. So how do we try and figure this out? While we were doing all of that, traditional kind of usability testing and research, we were also doing something very quantitative. And what we ultimately landed on is this methodology called a survival analysis. If any of you have seen Survivor, you're probably familiar with how this works, right? Who survives? And so what you would do is you take a big sample of people coming into your product. So we would carve off 1 million people who registered today. And what we would do is look at that 1 million people who registered today, and we would see what did they do? And what of those actions correlated with them being around later, with them surviving? And so you can see here's a bunch of actions we tracked, like making a comment, joining a community, following someone, getting followed. And we would see what was the biggest indicator of what made people come back the next day. How do we get them to return the following day? And you can see the number one thing that brought people back the next day was if they followed a collection on their first day. Remember those like lists of topics? So if somebody found a topic that interests them and they followed it, high degree of likelihood they would come back the next day. So that was good. But then we also wanted to see what makes them stick around longer. So we changed this, and you can see my lines and dots changing here. And we said, well, what's the strongest indicator of somebody coming back 3 weeks later? And while following a collection is still up there, you can see joining a community was the strongest indicator of whether or not somebody comes back 3 weeks later. So both of these things were really useful for predicting, are people going to use this? And remember, during the other process, what we did is we found that these collections and communities, those same two features, were useful for our happy users. And so we put them down inside of this navigation menu. So, well, what happened when we did that? This is what happened to how many people hit the collection screen that had a listing of all these topical pages. And you can see that little spike. People always ask, what is that? That was a test. Like, is anybody going to use it? Whoa, oh, okay. And then we launched it. We had a 600% increase in the amount of people daily hitting that page. Clearly, that's really huge. But then it also translated to a 300% increase in the amount of people who were following these collections. And so lots of people, not only did they check it out on that page, they actually went and started following these things. And we saw very similar stuff happen on the community side. You can see the amount of people who went to the community screen. You can see the amount of people who started joining communities. Both of those things go up and to the right. And if you come back to what I just showed you a second ago, that the strongest indicator of bringing people back after the first day and the strongest indicator of bringing people back 3 weeks later were those same two features that we just grew 300, 600%. What do you think happened? The answer is good things. And I want to pause for half a second here and kind of bring up the point, like the whole time we're doing this, we're kind of growing our confidence in the design decisions we're making. At the beginning, like we don't really know what we're doing. But as you do some of this usability testing, you do some of the survival analysis stuff, you look at your data, you go and talk to your happy users, you see new users, whoa, managed software center, no thank you. You start gaining more and more confidence, right, that you're down the right path. Because it turned out this design that we had before up here with that little triangle thing, it really was out of sight and out of mind. When we took the things that were already there, these aren't any new things. We just took the things that were already there, we figured out which things are important, we put them in here, we saw a huge impact on very critical metrics, right? The things that we cared about. So new navigation helped us simplify and focus, grew engagement, all of these are good things, but there was kind of another thing that we were going through as we were thinking about this. And that was this, I'll just bucket this under ergonomics, but it's really trying to design for the way people use technology, and in particular form factors. While mobile time spent has been increasing tremendously over the years, the average is right around here, like about 117% across all these form factors. The time spent on bigger phones, these things that we call phablets, which I still like to make fun of, right? But that's been growing the most because you got a bigger screen, you actually spend more time on it. And if you look at where the market is heading, and you can sort of see the trajectory from 2 years ago to where we're ending up now, the market share of larger phones has been increasing at the expense of smaller phones and tablets in general. So when we make design changes to our products, we kind of want to know where things are going. Because you don't want that design to be done the day you release it. You want to have some future forward thinking that accounts for things like market trends. And this is why I think it's important. 3 years ago, about 7% of active smartphones were 5.5 to 6 inches. 3 years later, it's like 43%. These things can swing really quickly. And why do we care? You probably have some sense of why we care about the size of phones. A, we care because we want to make sure things are comfortable for people. But B, we kind of have to have a sense of like how are people viewing our content? Under what circumstances? Other useful stuff to know. Smartphones from the 3 to 7 inch range, 90% of the time they're viewed in portrait mode. And those numbers go higher the bigger the phones get and the more modern the phones get. When you get to small size tablets, like 7 to 9 inch screens, you can see it's less, but still the majority, portrait. Once you cross that 9-inch line, then people shift to landscape as the majority use. So knowing kind of the size of these screens, how people interact with them, helps us make sure that we create comfortable software. Right? You want to put things in the nice green zone as opposed to the owie zone up here. Yeah, so we want as phones get more phablety, we want to make sure our designs become less ouchity, right? So for example, primary action to check in on this app called Swarm used to be up and to the right. Now they put it down in the center middle. Nice and easy, comfortable to hit when your hand is like this. Okay? So we want to be inside of this comfortable, easy to hit use. And if you come back to Apple Maps, they actually made a bunch of design adjustments that kind of account for this behavior. So once you're in direction mode, you kind of know where you're going. There's a little panel on the bottom, and you can effectively just swipe up with your thumb. You just sort of thrash at it. It flicks up. It gives you a whole bunch of information about where you're going. And then you can just sort of flop it down, and it comes right back. So it's just like quick and easy flick. Here inside of when you're looking at the directions in detail, you can also do the same thing, flip it up, and you get a whole bunch of nice ways to see the details, get the overview, turn on audio, and there's an opportunity to close it, although my animation there didn't work so well. Now, this is cool, but you have to be a little careful when you do this, because this is the Apple Music redesign that came out around that same time. And what we saw was a lot of people couldn't figure out how they could shuffle their music. If you say it's behind those 3 dots, it's not. the way you do it is you actually have to scroll the thing up. And there's shuffle and repeat. Right? That's how it goes. And I'm very fond of saying you don't have to be a designer to know where there's usability problems. It's very easy to find usability problems. You just look for the band-aids. Right? You know where people are hurt based on where they have bandages on. So let me show you an example of a design bandage. When the Apple support account tweets, hey, want to repeat that song? Here's an animated GIF of how to find that. That's a band-aid. Right? Can't find how to shuffle? Here you go. So that's one band-aid you see. Then in iOS like 10.2 or something like that, when you open up music, up pops a little modal. Now playing, you can swipe up to repeat, shuffle, and go next. Got it? Got it. You know what this is? Band-aid, right? These little mobile things. And then in addition to that, not only did they put in that overlay, but they changed the buttons to be these big things that actually say the word shuffle and the word repeat. Another band-aid you can find. So when you see these things, you know there was problems before. But all in all, this bottom card pattern is a nice example of some of these ideas, right? Bottom aligned, comfortable for use, and accounts for where things are going. So it's one of the reasons why we kind of align towards that bottom nav as part of this process as well. Okay. So far I've told you just a bunch of good things. We want to make it easier. We made it easier. We want to grow engagement. We grew engagement. We want to make it comfortable. We made it comfortable. And this is where most of these talks end, right? Okay, thanks, bye, good luck. But what about the negative stuff? Nobody talks about the negative stuff, right? Did anything bad ever happen? What do we get wrong? You know, like Spotify, actions are up 9%. So in the interest of continuing to kind of peel back the curtain behind this process, I'm going to talk about some of the things that were bad. And the first most bad thing that we heard from people was this. Our top complaint was, hey, this thing is taking up too much space. I like to see the big pictures, I like to see the big text, and you put this bar on here, and with this Android bar and that Android bar, I'm all barred up. And we had originally wanted to make it so that when you scroll, right, you scroll down the page, what would happen is the menus would go away and you could actually get this nice full screen view for beautiful images like that. Just didn't get around to it. Too many other things happening. But you know, it was in the works. It almost had made the cut. It didn't really get into the release. But it was super easy to get this out a week or two later because we just finished the work. And because it was the #1 complaint, it was pretty easy to rationalize it with everybody, right? So that was good. And by the way, there's some challenges with this implementation too, but I won't jump into those right now. The next one was a lot harder. The second complaint we got basically consisted of lots of people emailing me, tweeting me, posting to me one particular URL. And that particular URL was to this Android developers guideline page that we, Google, had put out, which basically says, don't use bottom tab bars. Other platforms use the bottom tab bar, but Android tabs do not use that. So literally for months, I would wake up in the morning and my inbox would be full of people like, hey, dumbass, why don't you go and look at your own company's design guidelines because apparently you can't read. You know? Like, I don't know, duh, like the action bar, like every other Android app. That was a very fun period of my life. And so what do we do about this? This is a much tougher issue. It's not just a feature that we can push. This is something that a very large company has publicly told a whole community of people making apps for 2 billion devices to do. Right? Much harder ship to turn. We couldn't just go and ship our own code and make this happen. So what we ended up doing is I started telling the story internally, very similar to what I told you. I started saying, hey, we did this survival analysis stuff. we brought these features and look at the numbers that went up and to the right. Look at this 600%. Look at this 300%. This is really working for us. Our friends at Photos, who are sitting right next door, basically said, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. We should try that out. They tried it out. They saw similar good things happen, and they released this. And what happened is a couple more apps within the company started doing this, started seeing similar impact to us. And we worked with them. And then finally, the material design team, which is responsible for these conventions and guidelines, said, hey, you know what? This is right. We should do something about this. And they updated the Android guidelines to include a bottom navigation menu, which is now out there for apps to use. Right? And some people were a little upset about this. How can you change this? But I like to think, guidelines should be an evolving thing. If we learn something, we should continue to make it better, right? Shouldn't blindly hold to rules that maybe were set during different phases of technology or things like that, right? So learning and continually changing, I think, is a good thing, as opposed to dogmatically sticking to a rule, even in the presence of data. And it's not just us in Photos now. A bunch of apps have gone into this. And it's funny to see, so this is YouTube, right? YouTube in 2014 had a hamburger menu. And then in 2015, they did a top tab menu. Then in 2016, they took some of that stuff out and put in a floating action button. And then this year, they went to this bottom navigation menu. And I like this picture and this sequence because it just shows what most people are doing all the time. We're like moving pixels around, right? Should I put it here? I don't know. Let's put them there. Let's put them over here. What if we put it over here? Right? And again, it comes back to like having the confidence to believe in the decisions you're making. There's a million ways you can arrange the navigation in an app. Which one should you do? How many are you going to try? Where's it going to end up? So complaint number 2 about the Google has guidelines that say don't do this. And we did it, was averted after a multi-month process, but I think it was worth it in the end. And then complaint number 3, I'll be honest with you. Complaint number 3 was the most emotionally challenging for me personally. Because I would receive commentary like this, thank you Bing for the translation. I brain-free spraying manure G+ bottom bar for a long time now. Even the Google gallery has also been falling. At Luke W, your mom blew up. So I called my mom. I'm like, Mom, are you okay? She did not blow up. It was okay. It's just kind of like a, false start there for half a second. But the number 3 complaint we got was just people didn't like it. Right? This stupid gray bar at the bottom is a horrible thing, right? When are you killing the ugly black bar menu? It's on and on and on like this. And I have to admit, it is puzzling to me in some ways just how much passion people have about app navigation menus. I put little dots on there so I don't offend anyone. For a while, there was a trending hashtag on Google Plus that was, does Luke get fired yet? And then they started replacing fired with other adjectives, which I'll leave to your imagination to figure out what those could be. And you know what? I'll be honest with you, this kind of sucks, right? Totally sucks to be told your mom's blowing up and you're brain-free spraying manure, and I'm not even going to read the last one, right? Doesn't make you feel good, does it? But how do you keep going, and why do you keep going? What if I was just like, well, Facebook did it? Well, how quickly could I back off from that position? If the only rationale I had for making this bottom navigation menu change is because I saw LinkedIn did it, right? Well, Spotify, they 9% actions, that's why. Really flimsy construct to stand on, right? But what if instead I was spending a whole bunch of time with people who are in a happy state? I've run survival analyses to see like the actions that keep people around. I've seen the metrics go up. I've seen that whole picture and I've been part of that whole process. How confident do you think I feel at that point? And how much more willing am I to wake up in the morning and read this again and be like, yeah, I understand, but I'm still going to do this. I still know it's the right thing to do. And by the way, I should say, everything's a learning opportunity. So did anybody notice a pattern kind of where a lot of these comments are coming from? You want to know what happened? In a number of Asian markets, there's a lot of like cheap Android tablet use. And people used Google Plus on there. And what happened with these like tablets that are kind of wide, when we added the bottom bar and it was translated into character-based languages, the text was really small. Right? It was just like 2 characters for each thing. So what people would get is this black bar on the bottom, and in the middle was like 4 little icons with like 2 words, and there's just this big spacing on the sides. And no wonder they're pissed off, right? And telling me it's horrible and foolish and looks bad. So even in the darkest corners of the trollosphere, there may be an insight lurking. So at this point, I think it's worth remembering this quote. This is from the first Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He actually ended up winning it 3 times in a row, Herbert Swope. And he says, I can't tell you how to be successful, but I can tell you how to fail, which is try to make everybody happy. And I think this is a really important thing that we forget a bunch of times, right? We're so focused on trying to make everybody okay with the changes that we're making that sometimes we ignore the fact that when somebody really hates what you're doing, it's a sign they care. Why am I getting all these emails? Because people are actually passionate about it. They're trying to use the thing. If nobody emailed me about it, then I would be really, I'd be really concerned, because that means no one gives a rat's patooey. When you get really happy people or really angry people, that's a good thing. When you get no reaction whatsoever, that's a dangerous thing. The other thing is the types of changes that we're trying to make, changes that are really impactful, changes that move things 600, 300%. Those are usually big, meaty changes. They're not like changing the button from green to yellow or whatever, right? We've come up with a methodology of A/B testing to like take arguments out of things. Because you make these tiny little things, oh, that performed a little bit better. Okay, it performed better. We're all good. And we don't take these big jumps, right? We don't make harder steps, things that actually rustle some feathers or frankly hurt people. And to come back to a tech quote, since this is a tech talk, not one about reporting, this is Mr. Steven Sinofsky, who ran Windows for a long time. He's now a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. And what he says here is products without a point of view have no point. And I like this because it kind of references the fact you need a compass, right? You need a direction to be going. And how do you tune your compass? How do you figure out the direction you should go? All these kind of processes that I walked you through, that iteration, that constant learning, that closeness to the customer, tunes your compass so that your point of view is sailing your ship in the right direction, right? And I think it matters a ton to get that right. The other point I'd like to make here is, and it comes back to what I was saying about the A/B testing. I hear a lot of people using the phrase data-driven decision making. Have any of you heard that? Data-driven, we're a data-driven company. Very dangerous, right? Like data shouldn't make the decisions for you. People should make decisions for you. And so data-informed, I think, is a great thing to aspire to be. We want to be a data-informed decision-making company. But data-driven, quite challenging, right? Especially when it comes time to stand up around big changes and things that may not be as popular. And so I think this point of view applies to things that may seem trivial or may seem small. I've also often had conversations with people that say things to me like, hey, Luke, you did all that work for such an obvious design change? Right? You did all that work just to make a bottom tab bar? Well, yeah, I did, right? And I think it was worth it. Not only do I think it was worth it, I think it was really, really worth it. And when you get that kind of question, I actually think it's a really positive indicator that you're doing something right. right? Such an obvious design change. Is it worth it, right? Is all that work and effort for something that feels so obvious worth the effort? Well, you tell me. So to wrap this up, and maybe I'll have time for a question or two if I'm lucky, we talked about a couple things. One, design is obvious in retrospect, but in order to reveal that obviousness, in order to go on that journey and know which path is illuminated, where's the light shining, where should you go, you've got to go through this process. You can't just copy patterns. And to do that, you want to get as close to insights as possible. And the more the merrier. You know, another common question is, should I do usability testing, or should I do A/B testing, or should I, do ethnographic field research? Sure, do whatever, right? The more you learn, the better off you are when it comes time to either make or defend that decision, the more confident you'll feel. And that, again, to come back to my point, you can't just look at the quantitative or the qualitative. You want to at least look at both sides. And last but not least, we just talked about it. No matter how data informed you are and how right you think you are, you're not going to please everybody. That's okay. That's why you have a point of view, a compass. And things that are impactful aren't always popular with everyone. And that's okay. You can piss some people off. I'll leave you with that. I think I left time for like 2 questions. Is that right, Toby, or not at all? Okay. There's mics in the aisles. If you want to ask a question, yay. If you want to eat lunch, yay. Okay, no one's rushing to the mics, so eat some lunch. I'll hang out up here and talk to people who would like to talk. Thanks.